Hey guys, it's me Kate again. So this video is going to be all about my yearly stats considering books. So let's start. First of all, going over some general information, uh, and format, age range, genre, and other things. Some stats might be a little bit wrong, but just because I'm listening to an audiobook at the moment and I'm not entirely sure if I'll manage to finish it in this year or the next. So, tot- so total number of books that I read is 903, 889 of whom I actually 890 of which I finished, and 11 that I DNF'd. Um, uh, uh, this doesn't include some, as I said, I'm not sure if I'll finish that audiobook and one other book in this year or the next, so that's why there are in total number of books read, but they're not marked as finished or DNF'd because I'm not completely sure will I finish this year. It took me 0.4 days to read the book. Total pages read is currently standing at 397,772. But as I said, I'm not still finished with all the books, so at the end of the year it might be a little higher, but it shouldn't go past 398,200 pages. So this averages for 441 pages per book, which means that I read 33,148 pages per month, or 1,809 pages a day. It never happens. I cannot read 1,000 pages in a day, but here we are. So for language reading, I read 856 books in English, which is 95% of my reading, and in Croatian we have 47 books, which is 5%. As for age range, we have 47 middle grade or children's books, which are 5% of my reading. Then for young adult books, we have 385 books, which is 43%, and 471 adult books, which is 52% of my reading. I think this is really funny considering how much adult is overweighing. Young adult is by almost 90 books, so it's wild. As for ratings, we have 224 5 stars, which is 25% of my reading. 512 4 stars, which are 58% of my reading. 21 3-star books, which are 2% of my reading. 12 2-star books, which are 1% of my reading. And 123 1-star books, which is 14% of my reading. I think this year was the year I I gave out most 1 stars in the last 4 years. So, and my average rating is for this year is 3.79, which is low considering that my average is usually about 4.5. So for the format, I read 166 physical books, which is 18% of my reading. I listened to 53 audiobooks, which is 6% of my reading. And I read 684 ebooks, which is 76% of my reading. But that's just because I was senior in high school, and we had a period of about 2 or 3 months where we didn't do anything in class, so I was just reading ebooks. I expect number of ebooks to drastically drop in the new year. I read 705 books for the first time, which is 78% of my reading, and I reread 198 books, which is 22% of my reading. So in January, I read 83 books, which is 9% of all reading that I've done in the year. In February, I read 172 two books, which is 19% of my reading. In March, I read 167 books, which is 18% of my reading. In April, I read same amount as I read in May, which is for 146 books. So each of those months takes up 16% of my reading. In June, I read 25 books, which is 3% of my reading. In July, I read 39 books, which is 4% of my reading. In August, I read 26 books, which is 3% of my reading. In September, I only read 14 books, which is 2% of my reading. In October, I read 33 books, which is 4% of my reading. In November, I read 29 books, which is 3%, and in December, I read 23, but if I manage to read those two other books, it will be 25, but it will still be 3%. As you can see, in February, March, April, and May, so that was like, those were the months I was talking about that I just read the ebooks because we did nothing in class, so yeah. As for the series that I read and standalones, I read 620 books which are part of the series, which is 65% of my reading, opposed to 339 standalone books, which is 35% of my reading. For books of this in the series, 279 of them was first in the series, which is 50%. In the middle of the series, we have 201 books, which is 38% of my 38 of them, 38% of them, and and as for the Latin series, we have 70 books, which is 12%. And the only reason I have bunch of first books in a series because I reread a lot of series, so each time I read the first book, I would mark it as the first book. So count that at least half of them are rereads, and the others are start of new series, which mostly I do not plan to continue. So we'll will be happy with that number because I tried a lot of series, not all of which I plan to continue on with. As for genre, I read one classic book, which ended up being less than 1% of my reading. I read 95 contemporaries, which is 11% of my reading. I read 477 fantasy books, which is 53% of my reading. I read one graphic novel, which is less than 1% of my reading. I read 42 historical fictions, which is 5% of my reading. I read 2 horrors, 3 mangas, 1 memoir, and 3 mysteries, all of which, each of which is less than 1% of my reading. I read 102 non-fictions, which is 11% of my reading. I read 78 paranormal books, which is 9% of my reading. I read 46 romances, which is 5% of my reading. I read 40 science fictions, which is 4% of my reading. And I read one thriller, which is less than 1% of my reading. So for notable subgenres, we have 81 paranormal romances, which is 9%. We have 103 contemporary romances, which is 11%. We have 13 historical romances, which is 1%. We have 340 high fantasies, which is 38%. And then we have 78 urban fantasies, which is 9%. We have 8 low fantasy books, which is 1%. Then we have 55 fantasy romances, which is 6%, and 3 shoujo mangas, which is less than 1%. Others either had notable subgenres, so they could be measured multiple, but then I put them in the other or none category because they didn't have one notable. So then for authors gender, we have 185 male authors, which is 20% of my reading. We have 630 female authors, which is 70% of my reading. And I have 88 other authors, which is 10% of my reading. And other encompasses when there's multiple authors of different genders. So, for example, if we have one male and one female author, or we have 2 male, 1 female, 2 female, 2 male, and so on and so forth. Or if author doesn't put themselves in male or female category. So as for author's race, I read 832 books by white authors, which is 92% of my reading, and this doesn't add up to 100. These percentages add up to 96%. So I think that I might have messed up a little in this stat in percentages. So I read 32 black authors and 39 Asian authors. I think that these percentages are wrong, so don't quote me on that. But expect the number of white authors to go down in the new year. But I'm planning to read more of black and Asian authors. As for publication year, I only put down the years that I had something, that I read something published in, because otherwise there would be a bunch of years with 0 books published in them. So I read 4 books that were published prior to 1900s, which is less than 1% of my reading. I had 1 book that was published between 1941 and 1950, which is less than 1% of my reading. I read 7 books that were published between 1951 and 1960, which is 1% of my reading. I read 2 books that were published between 1971 and 1980, which is less than 1% of my reading. I read 4 books that were published between 1981 and 1990, which is less than 1% of my reading. I read 20 books published between 1991 and the year 2000, which is 2% of my reading. I read 19 books that were published in the decade I was born, which is 2001 and 2000, between 2001 and 2010, and that's 2% of my reading. I read a whopping 697 books that were published between 2011 and 2020, which is 77% of my reading. I read 113 books that were published in 2021, which is 13% of my reading, and I read 33 books that were published in 2022, and that's 4% of my reading. I cannot to be sure that percentage of the books that were published between 2011 and 2020 really drop drastically, considering that this decade is only on January 1st moving into its 3rd year, so those numbers will continue to be the highest, but I expect more books that were published in 2021 and 2022 to get onto this list. As for pages, I read 25,126 books in pages in January, which is 6% of my reading. I read 59,447 pages in February, which is for 15% of my reading. I read 113,199 pages in March, which is 28% of my reading. In April, I read 57,640 pages, which is 14%. In May, I read 64,763 pages, which is 16%. In June, I read 7,597 pages, which is 2%. In July, I read 22,540 pages, which is 6%. In August, I read 10,597 pages, which is 3%. In September, I read 6,659 pages, which is 2%. In October, I read 12,527 pages, which is 3%. In November, I read 9,991 pages, which is 3%. And in December, up until now, which is December 27th, I read 9,296 pages, which is 2%. As for the number of the pages in the book, I read 103 books that were under 100 pages, which is 53% of my reading. This seems wrong. Yes, I think he is supposed to say 35%, not 53%, so ignore it. So I read 94 books that had between 101 and 200 pages, which is 10% of my reading. I read 142 books that were between 2000 which has between 201 and 300 pages. Again, I think it's supposed to say 35% instead of 53%, because I had 232 books that were between 301 and 400 pages, and that's only 26%. I read 144 books that were between 401 and 500 pages, which is 16%. And then I don't know which this 53 came from. It might be at the time when I did at the time in February, but not now. I read 61 books that were between 501 and 600 pages, which is 7%. I had 39 books that were between 601 and 700 pages, which is 4%. I read 32 books that were between 701 and 800 pages, which is 4%. I read 18 books that were between 801 and 900 pages, which was 2%. I read 5 books that had between 901 and 1,000 pages, which is 1%. And I read 27 books that were over 1,000 pages long, which is 3%. So now we're going into a kind of LGBTQIA representation that books I read had. So I read 158 books which had gay representation, which is 66%. I read 28 books which had lesbian representation, which is 12%. I read 22 books that had bisexual representation, it's 9%. I read 13 books with transgender representation, and that's 5%. I read one book that had asexual representation, and that's less than 1%. And same goes for non-binary representation. But I read 16 books with gender queer representation, which is 7%. As for the publisher, I only again put the publishers that I had on here. So I read 4 books from Profile, which is less than 1%. I read 11 books published by Gollancz, which is 1%. 8 by Knopf, again 1%. 112 by Simon & Schuster, which is 13%. 8 by Kottke Books, which is 1%. 16 by Znanya, which is 2%. 288 books that I read this year were in tip published, which is 32%. I read 8 books published by Penguin or Penguin Random House, which is 1% of my reading. I read 121 books published by HarperCollins, which is 14%. I read 46 books published by Bloomsbury, which is 5%. I read 6 books published by Vizimedia LLC, which is 1%. I'm sorry, my nose is running. I read 15 books published by Titan Books, which is 2%. I read 4 books published by Focus and 3 by vintage, and they're both less than 1%. Then I read 43 books published by Macmillan, which is 5%. I read 12 books published by Mosaic Kniga, which is 1%. I read 9 books published by Lumen, which is 1%. I read 3 books published by Little Brown, which is less than 1%. And I read 179 books that were published by either other publishers, or I couldn't find the publisher for them, and that's 20%. And thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe. Don't block my social media, my email, and some other stuff, and I'll see you in next one.